In this tutorial, we're going to be learning how to set up any SteamVR compatible headset inside of a new blank project in Unity. I'm using the Valve Index, but it's also going to work with either an Oculus or Vive or any SteamVR compatible headset. We're going to be using Unity version 2023 and the OpenXR plugin. We're not going to be using the old SteamVR plugin. So in this tutorial, we're going to get head tracking, hand tracking, and you're going to be able to put on the headset and see into the world, and we're going to get input from one of the buttons. In this case, it's going to be the trigger, and in this tutorial, we're just going to display either a 0 or a 1 in the console window, depending on whether or not we are pressing the trigger. So here's the script that we're going to use. The first line that we need is using Unity engine.input system, and that's going to let us use this variable type here, input action reference. This is going to give us a drop-down menu where we can choose the button that we set up in the input system. And then this line of code right here is the part that gives us either a 0 or a 1, depending on whether or not we're pressing the trigger, and debug.log just displays it in the console. So there's a lot of other setup that we need to go through in this tutorial, but here is just the script for reference. So now let's get into the rest of the tutorial. Hey everyone, welcome to Master Indie Tutorials. So I'm going to start a new tutorial channel because it doesn't really make sense to do tutorials and game development update videos on my main channel, so I'm going to separate that into two separate channels. And I really want to get back into tutorials. I used to do them years ago. I used to go by HTC Tutorials, but a lot has changed since then, and my most recent game was Jet Island, and even though I haven't updated it in a little while, it is still a ton of fun, and it's available now on Steam, and I would love for you to go check it out. So before we get started in the tutorial, the main glitch that took me forever to figure out was that in between the eyes of the headset, there's a proximity sensor, and that's normally meant to know when you're wearing the headset, but it turns out that unless that proximity sensor is activated, you can't get input from any of the buttons on the controller. You can get positional tracking, but you can't get any of the buttons. And I thought my system was broken for the longest time, so just remember that either you have to be wearing the headset or put your finger over the proximity sensor. I think this is really dumb, and I really wish there was a way to fix this, or at least some sort of like warning to tell you that's why you're not getting input. So yeah, let's get into the tutorial. All right, so we have a new blank project open in Unity. I used Unity 2023 and I just selected 3D Core, and besides that, this is a standard blank Unity project. So the first step is we're going to import some things from the package manager. So let's go to Window, Package Manager. So the four things that we're going to import is the input system, OpenXR plugin, and the XR Interaction Toolkit. And then we're going to import the starter assets from the samples section of the Interaction Toolkit. So let's do that. Let's start with the input system. So click on Unity Registry, search input, and it should come up with input system. If that doesn't immediately show up, you can manually type in the address of it. In this case, it's com.unity.inputsystem, and you would click here and do install package from GitHub and type that in there. So yep, there's the input system, so let's click on install. All right, now that I have the input system imported, it's asking me to restart Unity, so let's go ahead and do that. All right, now Unity has restarted, so let's go back to the package manager, Unity registry, and now let's type in OpenXR plugin. So we're going to select that and also install that. Once again, there's the com.unity.xr.openxr address that you can type in manually if it doesn't show up. Next is the XR Interaction Toolkit. So let's just type in XR, and then there it is right there, the Interaction Toolkit. So let's click on install. All right, now that we have the XR Interaction Toolkit installed, you'll see that this tab right here will appear that says samples, and from that we need the starter assets. All right, that was a lot of importing from the package manager, but that is everything that we need to get started with setting up VR and positional tracking and input from your VR controllers. So now we're done with the package manager window. So let's close that. And next we're going to want to go to project settings. I have that over here, but if you don't have that, what you can do is go to Edit, Project Settings, and then your project settings window will appear here. I personally like to just dock mine over to the side right there. Let's pull it over so we have a little bit more room. So the first thing we're going to do is go to the XR Plugin Management and select OpenXR. Then we're going to go to Project Validation, and we want to fix all of these things. And one of these things is that we don't have any controller profiles selected. So you're going to click on OpenXR, and then right here where it says Enabled Interaction Profiles, List is empty, we're going to click on the plus, and we're going to select whatever headset that we're using. So I'm using the Valve Index, and you can also add more than one. So if you want to also support Oculus and also support Vive, you can do that as well. Next, we're going to go to Project Validation, and we're just going to click on Fix All. All right, now all those error messages are fixed, so we're ready to get started. So let's pull that back over so that we have a little bit more room. And instead of the main camera, we're going to delete that, and then right-click XR, and we're going to select XR Origin. So if this doesn't show up, that means that you haven't imported the XR Interaction Toolkit. It will just say convert main camera to VR camera or something like that. So make sure you import the XR Interaction Toolkit, and we're going to select XR Origin. And you can name that whatever you want, like VR player or just player, but I'm just going to leave it as XR Origin. Next, we're going to open this little drop down. This little drop, whoops, sorry, I can't click it. This little drop down, and then we have our main camera, left controller, and right controller. So let me go back over to the inspector window, and you can see that there's a lot of settings for the left controller and the right controller. So you can fill up all of these manually, but it's way easier to just click on this little button here. It looks like two little sliders. So we click on that button, and then we see 3 different presets that we can choose from. So since we have the left controller selected, let's select the one that says left controller at the end there. And then we're going to close that, and we're going to click on the right controller, and we're going to do the exact same thing. And now our controller should be set up for positional tracking. And it also has some inputs for some default menu selection and stuff like that, but mainly the positional tracking is what we're looking for. So we should be all set to open up SteamVR and give it a test. All right, so now I have SteamVR running, just like we would if we were playing a VR game on Steam. And now let's hit this little play button up here. And now if I zoom in, if I select main camera and hit F, and then use my mouse wheel to zoom in, we should be able to pick up the headset and move it around. And you can see that now we have positional tracking. You can also put on the headset, and you should be able to see in VR this game world right now. All you can see is a skybox, but let's also select the left controller. Right controller. What's going on? I think... Oh, there it goes. I just needed to pick up the headset and put my finger over the proximity sensor to trick the headset into thinking that I'm actually wearing the headset, because that input doesn't actually start happening until you're wearing the headset. So remember to put your finger over the proximity sensor or just put on your headset. But as you can see with those red lines, my 2 controllers are moving as well. So now we have VR vision and positional tracking working in Unity. So the next step is to get input from the buttons on the controller. All right, so one thing we want to do just to test out to make sure that Unity is connected to the controllers properly before we start actually adding any scripts or input is that we want to go to Window, Analysis, XR Interaction Debugger. And we want to turn off interactors, turn off interactables, and turn on input devices. Let me just move that window down just a little bit. And then we're going to run the game again. Remember to also have SteamVR running in the background. And now with the game running, you can see that it says head tracking OpenXR, and we can open that. And if I move the headset around, you can see the values change of the position in 3D space, but we can't see the controllers. So once again, we put our finger over top of the proximity sensor, that little sensor that's in between your eyes, and then you can see that the index controllers have popped up. Now, I don't know which one of these is left hand and right hand, but let's see. I'll pick up the right hand one. I think it's this one. Is it this one? Yeah, it's this one. So I'm holding the controller in my right hand and I have my finger on the proximity sensor. And as I'm pressing different buttons on the controller, you can see that those true and false variables are turning on and off. So if you look at trigger, for example, you can see that as I squeeze it, the number goes from 0 to 1, and then trigger button goes from false to true. Primary button, I'm pressing that now, and now that's going from false to true. So we can clearly see that we are getting input from the controllers now. So the XR Interaction Debugger is all good to go, so we know that we're ready to move on to the next step. All right, so now let's go to our assets folder, and I'm going to go ahead and create a folder called My Assets, just to stay organized. Whoops. And we're going to open up that. And now we know that everything in this folder is stuff that we have created. So the thing that we want to create next is right-click, create, and you want to scroll down and let's create an input actions. And let's call this My VR Controls. You can call it anything you want. I just decided to call it that. And we're going to check this little box right here in the inspector window that says generate C# class and hit apply. Next, we're going, oops, gotta load. Okay, so now that that's loaded, let's double click on My VR Controls. And this is the window that we're going to use to edit all of our buttons. So let's add a new action map. And an action map is kind of like you might have one action map for running on land or swimming in water or driving a vehicle, just different categories of different types of input that your player might have. In the case of VR, let's do left hand and right hand. So let's call this right hand, and we can make a left hand later. I'm just going to do right hand for now, and we can see that it's already given us a new action, and we can click on this little drop down and it will say no binding. So this is the action of like something that we want a button to do. In this case, let's rename it and let's call this shoot, because we want to shoot our gun, and it's of type button. And the binding, and by the way, if you don't see binding, you can click on this plus arrow and click on add binding. You can also have a different binding for every different type of controller, like Index, Oculus, HTC Vive. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and I'm just going to do Index for now. So with that selected, we're going to click on Path, then we're going to scroll down to XR Controller, and we're in the right hand action map. So let's do right hand usages, and let's scroll down to, where is it? Trigger button. And this is all the different buttons on the index controller. So this is all ready to go. One thing I want to mention is that this menu right here was just all messed up in Unity 2022. Like you had to right click it, and then some of these buttons were overlapping. So yeah, it just seemed broken. So try to do this tutorial in Unity 2023, or maybe hopefully Unity has updated that in the future. So anyways, we're now done with this window. So let's click on Save Asset. That is very important. You want to click Save Asset or check this box that says Auto Save. And now we're done with this window. So let's exit out of that. And now we need to assign this to the interaction manager so that in this scene, we know that we can get input from this. So let's click on our XR origin, and we automatically have an input action manager right here. So we're going to click on action assets, and this is the default one that was added to get positional tracking for the controllers. So we're going to add one more, and it just copy and pasted the two. And we're going to drag and drop My VR Controls into that new element 1 that we just created. So now we can get input from both the default positional tracking input actions and also our own custom input actions that's going to be for our actual gameplay. So that's good to go. Next, we need a script that will be our player script. So right-click, create C# script. And if you're new to C# scripts, this is basically where we're going to write our code that's going to actually create all of our gameplay. So let's call this VR player script, or you can name it anything that you want. And let that load. And now that that's done, let's drag and drop it onto any game object in the scene. We could create a new empty game object. We could put it on the main camera, on one of the controllers. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to go ahead and just stick it on the XR origin. And now we have our player script here. But it's a completely empty player script. There's nothing in there yet. So let's open this up in Visual Studio and start writing the code for our, what will eventually be our player. You can either double click it here or double click it here, and it's going to open up Visual Studio. All right, so the first thing I want to do is just even test whether or not we are getting input from the trigger. And we are going to do this by displaying either a 0 or a 1 in the console window in Unity. So the three things we need to do in the script: number one, we need to write using Unity engine dot input system. We need to add this just so that we have access to a couple of tools that we're going to need. And the first tool that we're going to need, also make sure that we're inside of this bracket, but above all of this void start stuff. So right here on this line, we are going to want to write public. And public basically, in this case, just means that we can see it and edit it in the inspector. And then we need the type that this variable is going to be. So we're going to do input action reference. So that's going to be the type. And then we can name this anything we want. So this is basically going to be the shoot action or the shoot button inside of this script. So we can name this shoot. Yeah, let's just call it shoot. That works fine. So that is going to give us a variable in the inspector so we can actually select it from a drop-down menu and select the button that we created. So next, we want to display this in the console. And to do that, we write debug.log and then parentheses and semicolon. And then anything we put in the parentheses is what is going to show up in the console. So we could write quotation marks and write anything that we want in here, and that will show up in the console. Or we could write like a number or something and like, just write the number 1 in the console. But what we want is a specific number, 0 or 1, depending on whether or not we are pressing the trigger. So we're going to write shoot, and then we want to get the action part of that shoot, and then write read value. And then inside of these less than, greater than symbols, we need the type of value that we're going to read. And in this case, it's going to be something called a float. A float is basically a number that can have a decimal place, whereas an int or an integer is a number that cannot have a decimal place, so like a whole number. So in this case, it's just going to be float. So we're going to write float. And then we also need one more opening and closing parenthesis because getting the value is an action. But yeah, basically this line of code is going to write in the console a 0 or 1 depending on whether or not we are pressing the trigger. And just for future reference, this bit that I have highlighted is the part that gives us the 0 or a 1. And debug.log just writes out the 0 or 1 so that we can debug the game and take a look at that. So let's go back into Unity and let's give this a test. All right, so now that we're back in Unity and we have the XR origin game object selected in the hierarchy window, now in the inspector window under our VR player script that we added earlier, before it was empty and blank, but now we have this shoot variable, which is what we created before. So we're going to click on this and we're going to get a big list of all of the different things that we can add. And a bunch of these things were just default things, like for the positional tracking and some default menu stuff. So we need to find, I forgot what we called it, my VR controller. Where is it? Oh, sorry, I was confused. So it doesn't say my VR controller. It says right hand/shoot. So it's right here. So whatever we named the action set and the action itself, it's going to show up in here. So it's a big long list, so it's really hard to find. So once you find your action that you created, go ahead and double click on that. And we need the console window. If you don't have that opened up, I'm going to close it. Go to Window, General, Console, and I personally like to dock mine right there, so it's nice and easy to switch between the project and the console. So now with SteamVR open, let's run the game and see if we can get input from the right controller. So now you can see that because we put that debug.log inside of the update loop, update basically means every single frame. So every single frame, it's printing out the number 0. And if I press the trigger, it should switch to 1. But it's not. It's still staying as 0. And that is because of the proximity sensor on the headset. So pick up your headset, put your finger over top of the headset to trick it into thinking that you're wearing the headset, or you can just put on the headset if you want to, but you have to be able to see the computer screen. So put your finger over the proximity sensor, and now when you press the trigger, it switches to 1 every time you press the trigger. Make sure you pull it in all the way until it clicks, because that click is the trigger button. You can get a trigger access where it gives you decimal place numbers. So if you're pulling the trigger halfway, it gives you 0.5. But because we selected trigger button, it only gives us 0 or 1. So you got to make that click. So yeah, now we have button input coming in from the controller. So now I mean, if that's all you needed, you can go ahead and stop watching the tutorial now. You're all good to start converting your game into VR. But if this is your first VR game and you want to see an example of this actually being a game instead of just numbers on a screen, go ahead and keep watching. Hi, this is Editing Erica. I realize that this video is already getting way too long, so I'm going to have the next part be its own separate video. So in the next video, we'll add a gun to the player and make it so every time you pull the trigger, it shoots balls that can physically interact with other objects in the world. So in that episode, it's going to feel a little bit more like a video game, whereas this one is just numbers on a screen, proving that we can get input from the controllers. So yes, for right now, this will be the end of the tutorial. All right, hopefully that was helpful. I want to make more tutorials like this and go over VR stuff because I just really have a lot of fun making tutorials, and that's something I want to get back into. So yeah, once again, please check out Jet Island. Right now, I don't have a Patreon. I'm sort of thinking maybe in the future, if I make enough of these tutorials, I might do that. I haven't decided. So yeah, if I do that in the future, the link to that will be in the description below. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I have to say. Oh, also check out my development of my next game. It's taking a very long time, but it's basically going to be like Jet Island 2.0, but with photogrammetry graphics and a lot more dark and scary. And I think it's going to be really awesome. So you can check out the game development vlogs on that. So yeah, I guess until my next episode, I will see you later and keep making games.